to enhance the value creation of the company is one aspect of managing and monitoring, but the other side of the story of managing and monitoring is represented by the need to protect the value the company created. And this is a dramatic need for the private equity investor because, you know, the private equity investor at a certain time has to exit, maximizing the capital gain. So to protect the value created within the company is very relevant. To protect the value is not easy, and best practices of private equity investors all around the world suggest that a right way could be to negotiate, to insert within the relationship between the private equity investor and the company a certain number of covenants. Covenants are mechanisms regulating duties and rights of the private equity investor and the venture-backed company itself. The list of covenants is made by 9 different mechanisms we must have in mind to understand basically everything about the issue of protecting value. The first covenant is represented by lockup. What is lockup? Lockup is a mechanism where one of the shareholders can sell share before a certain time. Why is it useful? It's useful, for example, within startup business. In a startup business, one of the risks for the private equity investor is that the entrepreneur is going to sell the share immediately. And that could be very dangerous because the private equity decided to invest because of the skill of the entrepreneur. And if the entrepreneur decides to leave and to sell the share, it's a drama for the private equity. With the lock-up mechanism, the private equity investor is able to stop, to reduce, to mitigate this kind of risk. The second mechanism is represented by permitted transfer. What is a permitted transfer? Permitted transfer is a more sophisticated lockup because with permitted transfer, one shareholder can sell the share only with the approval of the other shareholder itself. Let's imagine again a case where a private equity investor decided to invest in a company. With a permitted transfer, the entrepreneur can sell a certain amount of share or the entire amount of share only with the approval of the private equity. As you can understand, it's a way again to mitigate a risk of exit of the entrepreneur. The third mechanism is represented by the staging technique. Staging technique is very popular in US and it's very popular for startup business. What's the concept of staging technique? The concept of staging technique is that the private equity investor is going to deliver money into different tranches, and every tranche is delivered only if the company is able to be compliant to certain numbers at certain milestones. What's the idea? Let's imagine again a startup. Startup is very risky activity, as you know. One story could be the private equity is going to give the entire amount of money in the time zero. Let's imagine 50 million euros. With staging technique, the idea is to say, okay, 50 million euros is the amount of money the private equity is going to give, but 50 million euros are split into 5 tranches of 10 million. And the condition to receive another tranche of 10 million is only that the company is compliant with certain numbers written in the business plan. As you can imagine, staging technique is a mix of a set of tools to reduce the amount of risk and to generate the right incentive for the company to get to specific results. The mechanism number 4, the covenant number 4, is represented by stock option. Stock options are very popular within investment banking system, but also very popular within private equity. What's the idea of stock option? Stock option is a contract, is a covenant where a certain shareholder can buy new share at certain favorable price. Why is useful within private equity? It's useful again, for example, in a startup, in early growth, or in all the cases where the entrepreneur is very relevant. With a stock option mechanism, the private equity gives an incentive to the entrepreneur to work a lot in the company, because if the entrepreneur is going to work a lot, he can buy shares at a very favorable price while the value of the share is bigger. It's very common, this kind of approach, in every moment where the private equity has got the majority of share and the entrepreneur has got the minority, and the risk is that the entrepreneur doesn't have the right motivation to work in the company. The mechanism number 5 is represented by callable and puttable securities. Callable and puttable securities are shares with call and or put options embedded in. The most common example is a puttable security. Puttable security means the private equity buys shares, but in the shares there is a put option. That means the private equity has the possibility to sell the shares to the entrepreneur. But shares could be also callable. Callable could mean that the entrepreneur has got a call option. That means has the possibility to buy the shares from the private equity and basically to fire the private equity itself. Callable and puttable securities are very common within private equity business to identify very different exit ways to the marriage between the entrepreneur, the company, and the private equity. The covenant number 6 is represented by tag-along right. What is tag-along right? Tag-along right is a covenant for minority private equity investor. With the tag-along, the private equity investor has the right to sell the shares to the entrepreneur at the same price the entrepreneur is going to sell. It's a very beautiful exit way, because in case the entrepreneur is going to sell shares to someone else, the private equity has the possibility to sell the shares to the same price. The covenant number 7 is represented by drag-along right. What is drag-along right? With drag-along right, the private equity has the possibility to ask to the entrepreneur to sell the shares at the same price the private equity is going to sell. Why it's very relevant, the drag-along? It's very relevant because with the drag-along, the private equity has basically the possibility to sell the 100% of shares of the company without having the 100%. And obviously, when you can sell the 100% of shares, you can negotiate a wonderful price. The covenant number 8 is represented by the right of first refusal. Right of first refusal is a mechanism, is a covenant where the private equity has the right to buy the shares from the entrepreneur at the same price the entrepreneur is going to sell to someone else. Basically, is a mechanism the private equity want to have to protect the value of the amount of share it's got in its portfolio. And the last mechanism, the number 9, is represented by the exit ratchet. What is the exit ratchet? Exit ratchet is a covenant where, in the moment in which one of the shareholders is going to sell shares to another one, a percentage of the capital gain is given back to the other shareholder. That's the case, for example, in which the private equity is going to sell shares, the entrepreneur is very powerful, and he wants to receive a percentage of the capital gain of the private equity. Or on the contrary, if the business is super good and the private equity gave a lot of money to the entrepreneur and the entrepreneur is going to exit together with the private equity wants to have back a certain percentage of the capital gain of the entrepreneur as a reimbursement of the big support the private equity gave to the company itself.